name is Georgia Joseph, and I am the production director at 5Q. And today we are going to be talking about internet trends and how they relate specifically to education. And internet trends, Web 4.0, everything that has to do with the ubiquitous web, the symbiotic web, but also talking about some things that are going on right now that are going to be leading up to that. So I think we'll just get started. I probably shouldn't admit this, but I'm going to be really transparent with you. Although I'm sure by looking at me you could have guessed. I was a teenager in the 1970s. And that was the decade of more useless trends than all previous decades combined. I mean, think about it. For those of you that didn't experience it, some of you might remember it, things like mood rings, puka shells, bell-bottom pants, hot pants, the Beach Boys. Just a terrible, terrible decade. So just because something is a trend doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing. So today we're going to be talking about trends in the digital world, but we don't know where all of them are going to go yet. We don't know how good or how useful they're all going to be. But we need to be watching them because that's our job as educators. So let me just take a little poll. How many of you in the room are teachers of some type or another? Okay. In ministry? Okay. Anybody here in the business world? You're the only one. Let me just ask what type of business you're in.
I'm just a public relations social media manager. I'm in education, kind of, but I'm not a teacher. So.
Okay. Well, you know what? You just made my point. Over the course of my career, I have been a teacher, and I have been on full-time staff with a church in ministry, and now I'm a businesswoman in the marketplace. And what I have found is that teaching and marketing communications in the business world are two sides of the same coin. And the line is getting blurred more and more in the 21st century. In both instances, you are trying to communicate to a person because you want them to be changed, you want them to be transformed, and you want them to do something that, that you think that they should be doing. Okay, before we get into the presentation, I want to let you know the slides will be available, so you don't need to worry about furiously taking notes. The other part of this is that this topic, we're going to be breaking some new ground. And so I want you to feel free to put up your hand, to talk, to stop me, to start a discussion about something that's of interest to you. I have a lot of material, but it's not going to be the end of the world if we don't get through all of it today. I am sure that in your areas, when we get talking some of these things, there are going to be things that you know more about than perhaps anybody else in this room. And so would just love it if you would feel free to turn this into an interaction and a discussion, and we can all educate each other. All right. Think for just a minute, what are some of the technologies that you use in your work on a regular basis? Just think about it for a minute. Think about the ones that you like the best, that are the most effective. But see if you can think about, if there is one, and I won't put you on the spot, the hottest new technology that you use that maybe nobody else uses besides you. You are like the first one to discover it, and it's fantastic. So does anybody want to share what some of their favorite new technologies are that they use in their classrooms, in ministry?
I use the poll everywhere so that students can text in their answers to quizzes.
Really?
Yeah, I like it.
That's nice. That's great. Anything else?
It's not necessarily new, but I work in tech support for a seminary, and we have the ability for students to tweet us issues. And sometimes a student will be able to notice an issue a lot quicker than anybody else will.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a greater response time because of that availability.
Yeah. Twitter is the new news media, isn't it? Good. Anything else?
I
I work in rural Mexico, and so PowerPoint is still new there.
Okay.
And, but we're seeing a lot of the young people, their cell phones are finally putting Bibles on their cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
I carry 21 Bibles on my cell phone,
Good for you.
and it's great to see them opening their eyes.
Uh-huh. Okay. The internet sure has grown up, hasn't it? And you look at where computers were in 1960 compared to where things are going now. The evolution has been so rapid that it is changing everything. The digital revolution is changing everything. The future is going to look very different, even from what it does today. And we are all going to need to be prepared for it. It's like when you have kids. How many of you have kids? And those of you who are a little bit older, you might walk around the house sometimes and just say, oh my goodness, where did all the time go? When did that kid grow up? And today actually is my 31st wedding anniversary. My husband and I were both graduated from Biola 31 years ago. And we have 3 children. And I remember when our first child was born, we were like feeding him and changing him and holding him all the time. And it was this completely new experience. And at that time, we could not ever imagine that we would do anything with that child but feed him and change him and hold him. Well, guess what? Now he's 22 years old, 23 years old. He takes care of himself. When did that happen? And it's very much the same way with the internet. If the internet was a kid, this is about what its growth might look like. So let's spend just a couple of minutes defining the versions. These terms are thrown around all the time. For each one of these, you're going to get somebody who will probably argue passionately with you that it's a different way. You can ignore them because that's what the internet is all about, is arguing passionately with people, right? I mean, somewhere tonight, somebody is wrong on the internet, and so we have to fix that. So some of the things that I'm throwing out here, yeah, you know, there'll be people that will disagree, but in general, the era of Web 1.0 was in the 90s, and the point of Web 1.0 was just to connect information. So that was the time of the static web. Another phrase was the read-only web. Brochure websites happened then. I think the biggest thing in terms of interactivity would have been rudimentary shopping carts, started in around the 1990s. Web 2.0 then was about connecting people. So that is known as the read-write web. It's interactive. That's when blogs showed up, wikis, and social networking sites. Web 3.0, which is where we're at right now, at least that's what most people think, is known as the semantic web. Semantic, in other words, giving meaning to things. So it's not just about data anymore, it's about interpreting the data. And the example that you see of that probably most of the time in your daily lives is when you go to do a search on Google. Have you noticed how a couple of years ago Google started filling in your search phrase? It gives you suggestions. Mm-hmm. It's because their programming, their algorithm has gotten to the point with the use of artificial intelligence, natural language, that they can anticipate, based on their mountains and mountains of data, what are some of the things that you might be searching for. And so it gives you suggestions. Super helpful if you don't know what you're looking for. If you've only got one word, you type it in, and then there are several options for you to try. So that's Web 3.0. That's the semantic web, the web of meaning. Data is huge right now. Amazon.com is one of the best examples of that, in that they have data on millions and millions of users that they then use to personalize your experience. Again, Web 3.0.
Is there any reason why you're forecasting it ends up to 2015?
3 out of 5 experts polled on the internet said so. It's just, yeah, that's 2 years from now. So the expectation, and we'll get to this in a minute, is that Web 4.0, the Internet of Things, is, right around the corner. That's a great question though, because people are still arguing about whether it's even possible to do the semantic web with the type of programming that can actually interpret information. interpret what people are wanting. There's a lot of discussion really in the programming world is, can you even program for that? Programmers that are really into artificial intelligence and natural language and all of that kind of thing. Can we really connect all knowledge semantically so that it makes sense? So it could be that Web 3.0 never ends. But right now what they're saying is, yeah, you know, maybe around 2015 we will have that problem licked. Knowledge will be meaningful on the internet without the human intermediary between it. Great question. Then finally, Web 4.0 is known as the ubiquitous web, ubiquitous like Starbucks. Symbiotic, which means interdependent. This is the web of artificial intelligence. This is the web of the Internet of Things, where your stuff talks to each other, where it anticipates what you need in advance. Your devices collect information on you through apps and all of the other things that you use, store that, then can understand what it is you need to do next. Lots of examples of that, but one of them might be that your refrigerator notices when you're out of milk and sends a request to the store that you need milk. Your washing machine notices that it's not working right and sends a request to the plumber to come by and take a look at it. So, talk a little bit more about that in a while, but you can see just even from that little bit of information that the possibilities are endless. Nobody really knows when exactly that's going to start. There's a lot of talk about it, or when it's going to end. So if the web were a kid, 1.0 would be talking to, like you do with little ones. Web 2.0 is going to be talking with when they can interact with you. Web 3.0 is listening and interpreting. Web 4.0 is anticipating and predicting. As with a person, from the time they're born until the time they become an adult, everything has changed. The internet of today is nothing like the internet of the 1990s, and it's not ever going to be again. So, the future is going to look very different than today, and you may feel like that scientist at some point in time looking into the future. Okay, so some examples would be machines with brains that can talk to each other, anticipate your needs, a car that will drive itself, a house maybe that will clean itself. Okay, one day, this was a few years ago, all of my kids were still at home. And I came home from work. This was during the summer, so they were off at school. My husband worked at home, so he was there, but you know, he went on calls and stuff like that. Came home one afternoon and walked into the kitchen, and it was spotless. And when I say spotless, I mean there wasn't a drop of water left on the sink. I started looking around a little bit, and I realized that there was not a single paper towel left in the house anywhere. Not one. Now you need to realize that when I came home from work during this period of time, there were dishes in the sink. There was usually some kind of soup bubbled over on top of the stove. There was crunchy things on the floor that nobody had bothered to sweep up. So for me to come into the kitchen and find it spotless was unheard of. So much so that I decided I was not even going to question where all of the paper towels went. The kitchen was clean, and that's all I need to know. Web 4.0 is going to work something like that. You're going to come home, your kitchen's going to be clean, and you will probably still have all of your paper towels, but you won't be able to necessarily explain how it happened, but the machine will know that. Okay, part of this new era, Web 4.0, is augmented reality. I'm sure that you have been reading about that, hearing about that. Google Glasses is part of it. There are apps that you can get on your smartphone now that when you look up something, it can give you a bunch of extra information just by pointing your phone the direction where you're going. Give you lots of information, so this can be really useful. I mean, you can find out where there's a coffee restaurant if you need coffee. You can find out if there was recently a robbery on the corner that you're standing on, and so you might want to go to a different corner. Lots of useful information that can be given. Could also be kind of scary. I mean, a little bit like mind reading. A little bit like, maybe I don't want to know all that information about that person. And how are you going to filter it? You know, and he's thinking, whoever he's looking at, he's thinking, wow, this person really likes me. Well, this person doesn't even know who he is. He just is like, oh my goodness, my glasses are reminding me that I'm supposed to know this person. So there's going to have to be some safeguards to some of this. And there are people who are already talking about what some of those safeguards need to be because, I mean, you're still a private person, right? You don't want everybody to know everything about you. So that's going to be one of the challenges. Another thing that I think that we are going to be looking at, especially over the next couple of years, and I think this relates to every single one of you, I believe firmly that the line between work and play and school is going to gradually blur to the extent that it disappears entirely. Because the things that you do to be successful at work are very similar to the things that you do when you play. And playing is a wonderful way to learn. And the way that games are set up right now, there is instant feedback. You automatically know whether you've done good or whether you've done bad. This generation, the ones that you teach and the young people that you work with, they expect to be measured. They expect to be evaluated constantly, all the time, because that's what happens in their game world. So science fiction is going to be real. So this is why you need to be prepared. There are some benefits to this. First one is that you will excel at teaching. Even if you're in the business world, maybe it's marketing, education, you will excel at teaching if you can do this well. You're also going to excel at building community, which is very important for what you do. And you're going to be able to shine a light into the darkness. I mean, it's no secret that there is a very dark and seedy underbelly to the internet. And as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ and the salvation that he brings, it's our job and it's our responsibility to be a light in that darkness. So you will be able to excel at your profession. You will be able to excel at building community. You're going to be a light in the darkness. Now, one of the problems is that, you know, people are resistant to change. Change is normal, but people don't like it. But if you persevere, you're going to be able to be the one who shapes the outcome rather than the one who is shaped by it. So that's the reason to spend some time looking at this. All right, to succeed, I think you need to do 3 things. And we're going to talk about those today. First, to identify and retain the timeless truths. So there are things that don't ever change, right? The fact that Jesus Christ died for our salvation and rose on the 3rd day is a timeless truth that never changes. You need to identify what those are in the changing world and make sure that you hold on to them tightly. Second thing is to master the constantly changing context. Your context might change if you're a teacher from year to year. New set of kids come in, completely new context. You're going to need to master that. Third thing is you're going to need to evaluate new developments with wisdom and discernment. This goes back to my 1970s example. Not all new things are good. There's going to be a lot of things coming down the pike, and it's going to be your job to evaluate them with wisdom and discernment. Some you will adopt, and others you will be cautious about. Okay, so some truths are timeless, and I've chosen 3 that I'm going to talk to you about. At the end of this section, I'm going to ask you for what you think some of the timeless truths are for your profession. I think that this is the one that we have to get right. All of the talk that we're going to do about 4.0 doesn't matter if we don't get the timeless truths right. Okay, so the first one I think we have to remember is that people are hardwired for community. Now this relates super, super closely to everything that most of you do. Lots of the conversation now is around distance learning and digital relationships and church on TV, distributed church. People are hardwired for community. They need friendship, they need intimacy, they need belonging. How are you going to bring those important things into this space that seems to be determined to separate us and keep us apart and to make us feel like we have community when we really don't? I read the creepiest story a couple of weeks ago. It turns out that there was this woman, older woman, who lived alone, spent a lot of time on Facebook. That was her favorite thing. After a really long time, maybe a year, one of her neighbors realized they hadn't seen her in a while. And so they called the police. Police came to the house. The woman had died about a year previously, sitting in her chair on Facebook, and nobody realized it. She was found there all those months later, still sitting in that chair with her computer still on. There's nobody in her life. Her only community was on that computer screen. So we can't let that happen. As interested as we are in some of the trends and the tools, we can't let that happen because people are hardwired for friendship, intimacy, and for belonging. The other thing is people are motivated by autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Okay? Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If you've ever watched a kid learn how to ride a bike, you know how persistent someone can be when they're trying to learn something new that's important to them and has meaning to them. That is not ever going to change. No matter how you set up your online courses, no matter how you set up your ministry across, various continents with people, the autonomy, the mastery, and the purpose are always going to be there. When my oldest son was about a year and a half, he was learning to talk. We didn't understand always a lot of what he said, but he tried really hard. And there was one day he was sitting in the kitchen, and I vividly remember it. And there was something he needed to communicate to me that was super important. So important that he said what it was he wanted to say, and he was not satisfied with my, yeah, baby, that's okay. And he's like, no. And he said it again. And I didn't get it. But I realized this time I wasn't going to fool him into thinking I understood it when I didn't. And so I'd say, yeah, I'm sorry, hon, I don't understand what you're saying. He said it again. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember that bother was in there. And he used the word bother a couple of different times. I'm like, hon, I don't get it. And he sat there and he pulled himself together and he concentrated, you could just see him, and he said, this is bothering me. He wasn't trying to say bother, he was trying to say bother. When it mattered to him, he figured out how to get his tongue between his teeth and say the word bother. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's got to be a part of how we approach this next century. And then my third one, this is something I'm incredibly interested in. It is a timeless truth. It's probably not the most important timeless truth in the world. And I won't argue that point. But the fact is that cognitive science has learned a lot about how our brains operate. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind when we're working with digital tools. Because nothing changes. Nothing has been changed if nothing has been changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. If it's not changed in long-term memory, it hasn't been learned. And what that gets to, I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, is transformation. Again, as Christians, we are all about transformation. So if we want there to be that change, it has to be deep. So how does something get into long-term memory? Meaningful associations, multiple senses, emotional significance. 3 super challenging things to provide in a virtual online distributed environment. We're going to have to give that some thought. We're going to have to figure out how to do those things because that is how transformation happens. That's how it gets into long-term memory. That's where we get deep learning, grappling with ideas, undergoing transformation in the concepts that people hold, and their learning having influence. And that's what we're all about. So, here in 2013, most of your online success is going to depend on your offline behavior. How you think about things before you turn on the computer, the plans that you've made, and how proactive you've been about addressing some of the weaknesses. So I want to make sure I haven't forgotten any other timeless truths in the work that you've been doing. I don't know if as you've been working in your digital spaces, in your classrooms, with your ministry people, if you've found anything that you come back to over and over again. It's like your North Star, the thing that guides you. If so, feel free to share.
I would say students can sense a passion or
Mm.
lack of passion
Mm-hmm.
on the teacher's part. And so it's important to have that passion if you want to inspire them to also learn the same thing.
Yeah, passion is another one of those things that might be a little difficult to communicate across a fiber optic cable. Yeah, good. Anything else?
It wouldn't necessarily be a guiding star, like you said, but you can't all enter.
Yeah.
If it's a bad class or if it's a bad idea to begin with,
Yeah.
technology at it is just not going to solve it. It's not
Yeah.
gonna save it.
That's true. Well, and if you're lucky, throwing the technology at it will help you discover that it's a bad idea sooner. Be a good thing. That's one really nice part about working with the tech-savvy generation, is that they recognize a bad idea very quickly, often, and don't have patience for it because it doesn't work. Yeah, good. Anything else? Okay, let's go on to number 2, master the changing context. I don't know if I agree with this, but I thought I'd put it up there since it's interesting. To improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often. If that's the case, this is the most perfect decade in the history of mankind, I think, because we change constantly. But I don't think we even realize sometimes we're changing. I think that whatever time period, whatever sort of moment we're in, it's like with our my baby. You expect that that's going to stay that way all the time. And so no matter how much things change, we're always kind of caught off guard by it, aren't we? So here's an example. Back in 1998, we got our first computer that was hooked up actually to the internet, and it looked just about exactly like that. We were so excited. I mean, we'd had computers before, but this was the first time we were online. And I remember my husband unpacked it, got it all set up. I mean, we set up this special spot for it. Honestly, guys, it was almost a shrine. I hate to admit that, but it was. And everything plugged in and turned it on, and it was working. And he looked around at the rest of us. We were looking at him with anticipation, and he said to us, "This is all the space we'll ever need." And he believed it. That computer with its 4 gigabyte hard drive, or however teeny tiny it was, in his mind was all the space we would ever need. Now, here in 2013, we know that that's ridiculous. That really, if you're going to play a decent game, you need at least 5 times that amount of space, right? And so what are the things that we're looking at now as if they are perfectly fine, they work perfectly well for us, but in another 10, 15 years, we will look at as ridiculous or completely unuseful? All right, here's a scary thing to think about, and you may have thought about this before. This year's kindergarten class will never have lived in a world without mobile devices. Okay, the iPhone was introduced in June 2007. So they will actually never have lived in a world without smartphones. This year's kindergartners. Dan Rosenzweig, he's a CEO of Chegg. He says the shift away from traditional computers will be pronounced. I think this is something that's very important for anyone who's attempting to influence or educate to realize. If you don't take anything else away today, take this away. The PC will not be a part of the current generation's vernacular. And I mean, I know that in most workplaces you go in and you can't even think or imagine of what your workplace would look like without your desktop or your laptop. But that is going to change. And it's going to change with this generation. So how are you going to be where they are? How are you going to be meeting them where they're at and addressing their needs? Okay, so to answer that question, I want to take a quick look at 6 key drivers of technology. Just ask yourself how many of these you've experienced. As I'm going through them, interrupt if you want to give me some examples, okay? Tell me about them. First one, people expect to be able to work, learn, and study whenever and wherever they want to. Now, my company is what's known as a distributed company. We're not a virtual company, we're a real company, but we are distributed. I'm one of only, right now, 3 people in the company who actually work at the corporate office. Everybody else works wherever their home is. And we're really flexible about when they're online, when they're available to everybody. We have some core hours, but it's not at all the 8 to 5. And the reason is because the generation of people that we want to hire, the young programmers in their 20s, and the designers, and even the young managers in their 30s, have this expectation for what their work life is going to be like. What we're finding is that we're having a fabulous, very easy time hiring young fathers. Because young fathers in their 20s don't want to come home at 7 o'clock at night, see their kids for an hour, tuck them into bed, and that's it. Completely different perspective. And so we have a whole group of young men in our company who want to be active participants in the lives of their children. They want to work whenever and wherever it works for their family. It can be a little bit hard if you're in a traditional environment. You know, if you've got a kid coming into your classroom who's got this idea that they're going to work whenever and wherever they want to, might be a little bit of tension there. But we're going to be seeing that more and more. Okay, cloud computing, we want our information to be accessible on any device. So of the various things that I have, I've got my laptop, I've got my tablet, I've got my phone. For me, an app is only worthwhile if when it syncs, I have the most updated information everywhere, all at the same time. That's becoming the expectation. That is becoming the standard. So you have applications like Dropbox, Evernote, cloud word processing like Google Docs, so that there is a seamless transition from one device to another. Again, if you haven't seen that in your classrooms already, you're going to. The world is increasingly collaborative, driving changes in the way students and projects are structured. Now, this is specifically geared toward those of you that are in education, because this is the education track, but you're going to find it at work too. If you, again, this is something we see in our distributed environment where it's very hard to get collaborative teams together in a distributed, virtual way. The expectation that people have is they want to work together as a team. They want to be able to do things differently. They want to be able to think creatively. That's going to become the standard. Since information is everywhere, the quality of mentoring will make a difference. It may be that the mentor is going to become the new teacher. That will actually be the role for those of you in education. There may be a point where you're not called a teacher anymore, or a professor, or an educator. You're called a mentor. Because that is going to be the process of helping your students, your charges, to sift through this unimaginable volume of data and help them to understand what's going to make a difference and what isn't. Hybrid learning models can leverage the online skills students have already developed independent of academia. Now, another huge trend that we are seeing is that people come into the structured, formal learning environment with an entire life of learning that's happening outside of that environment. Saw it probably first and a lot with people who homeschooled. Homeschoolers were among the first on the internet back in the 1990s. The thought that they brought to all of this is that education doesn't have to happen in a specific place. Education can happen anywhere. And with the explosion of the online tools that we have, we are seeing that. If you go into most people's homes, you might see their 5-year-old sitting there on a tablet and learning something. You might see their 12-year-old doing exactly the same thing, or listening to something while they're doing chores around the house that is teaching them. So they don't come into your classroom anymore as blank slates, if in fact they ever really did in the first place. They come in with all of these experiences, all of these facts, all of this information right at their fingertips. So how are we going to create a meaningful situation for them? How are we going to leverage that? How are we going to make them feel comfortable and not like they have to sit through what everybody else knows or what everybody else doesn't know when they already know it? How can they contribute? So we're going to need to be thinking about that. What are some of the learning models that are going to change the traditional ones that we've used for so many years? And then finally shifting from teacher-centered to student-centered education. And real life issues are very important to this generation. They want to talk about real life because it doesn't matter if it's abstract, academic. If they can't tie it in to their experience, it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. So education is changing as more and more learning is self-directed outside of school. Another thing that we need to be thinking about for our current context, and again, this is an area where some of you may have an awful lot more of experience of this than I do. The way that this young generation is growing up, they are having different experiences. And there are a number of doctors, researchers that believe that this is almost creating a completely different brain structure. They are used to multitasking. They can switch immediately from one thing to another. Attention spans. Are they longer or are they shorter? Yeah. Yeah, are you seeing that?
I'm saying shorter.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, and if what we're seeing is then, you know, we've got this entire population of people who is experiencing the digital world this way, we have to start to wonder, is their brain structure being affected? And if their brain structure is being affected, the old ways of working with them and communicating and teaching are not going to be working. So digital natives are used to receiving information really fast. They want you to get to the point. Don't dawdle. They like to parallel process and multitask, and this is really important. This is important if you're in marketing. It's important if you're in teaching. They prefer graphics before text. So if you start looking around websites, you're going to see smart website owners, smart marketers make the picture, the video, the visual experience, it comes first, and the text-based content comes later.
Can I add something with the,
Sure.
with the text? The other key is to splitting it up when you do have to do text online and not doing long paragraphs when you're reading it online. It, you know, and it may go against some grammar things. Now I'm talking about for papers and stuff, but when text is online, when you do have to communicate through text, having it, you know, having one sentence and then a space and then another sentence and a space makes it much easier to read, much easier to scan, and the chances of people reading it go up exponentially.
What has been your experience with that?
Both with writing a website, writing a blog, you'll get people will stay on the page much longer if they're reading a blog post, if there's much more space because they can scan it or can read it. But if you hit big blocks, you know, big chunks of text are no big deal when you're reading a Jane Austen novel. It's like, oh yeah, there's a sentence, it's all one sentence and it's this long and we're okay. It's okay when it's in print, but when it's online, it's much harder to read.
Mm-hmm. Very, very true observation. Yeah, good. Anything else?
I see the same thing when I try to email my students. I'm very cognizant of trying to make it as short as possible or even bullet points. Because otherwise they're going to read the first sentence and not the rest of it.
Bosses are that way too. Yep, that's right. Other thing is email is for parents, not kids. I mean, right? Okay.
What's the alternative?
Text.
Do we text our students announcements?
Yeah. Well, some schools do. I know my daughter's school does, which is good. Otherwise, she would never know if school was canceled that day, which would just be a horrible thing for her. You can't imagine how bad that would be if she actually got up 2 hours earlier than she was supposed to. By the way, I'm from Iowa, and I moved there from Wisconsin. They close school in Iowa if the butterflies sneeze the wrong way. I mean, you would not even believe it. There's fog. Oh my goodness, we're going to start school 2 hours late because there's fog. There are 2 measly inches of snow on the ground. We're going to cancel school today. Just can't believe it. And my daughter would never know any of that. She would be out going to school in the snow because in Wisconsin, they don't close school unless there is a foot of snow, if they didn't text her. If they sent her an email, she would be the only person in class on that day. Anything else? One other hallmark is that feedback from peers is expected for this group. They don't sit and work in a bubble. They don't, the way that I learn, I like to just go off by myself where it's quiet and spend a couple of hours and just read and study. This generation is not like that. They haven't learned if they haven't gotten feedback and input and bounce their ideas off of their peers. Again, how do you make that happen? How do you ensure that that happens in your context? So all of this up here, don't anybody die of fright, but this is table stakes, okay? This is just the price of admission. This is not being cutting edge. This is not being ahead of the curve. This is where it's at right now with all of this. Imagine what it's going to be like in 10 years. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean that it's going to be worse. It might mean that a number of very efficient organizations buy up a lot of these. And we actually have fewer but much stronger and less diversified entities. We need to be watching that. Okay, so what are the now skills? The skills that our young people are going to have now. They need to learn, okay, remember they can get information whenever they want, right? That's not difficult for them. They need to learn how to protect their privacy online. I don't know, the people talk a lot about the prefrontal cortex in adolescents and young adults, how it's not quite fully developed, and that's why 20-year-old young men go crash cars, because it never occurred to them that driving 80 miles an hour around a curb could possibly be dangerous. And in a few years, when their prefrontal cortex is fully developed, then they realize that that was a stupid thing to do. Most of the young people that we're working with are not there yet, and they don't understand privacy on the internet. They don't realize that once it's on there, it is on there forever. So we need to be teaching them about privacy protection. Identity management. Who are they online? Can make or break getting a job later in life if they haven't paid attention to that, even when they are my daughter's age. How are they supposed to create and organize content? I mean, how many billions and billions of pages are on the internet? All content, right? They need to learn how to create and organize it. How, with all of that information, are they going to filter it? And how are they going to select what they need? I mean, there are a number of apps and things that will help you with that, but you need to be having those conversations with them. One of the apps that I use I use 2 apps for filtering and selecting information, because I'm in the middle of information overload. And often they're called social readers. So one of them is Flipboard. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Flipboard, it's real common. And what it does is it only gives me selected information. It monitors my Twitter feed for me. I tell it kind of what magazines and topics I'm interested in, and it sends me information only from those magazines and topics. And I don't have to worry about anything else. If there's something that's really interesting to me, I use an app called Pocket. And I just automatically hit a button in Flipboard, it saves it to Pocket. I can tag it, and then I can get back to it later. So when I was preparing for this presentation for the last, 6 to 8 months, everything new that I read about what's going on the internet, I just saved to Pocket, I tagged it Biola.digital. Then a couple weeks ago, I could start going through all of that and saying, what's relevant, what's not relevant. There's another one called Zite, Z-I-T-E, and when I tell that app what I like, it remembers what I like. It gives me more articles about what I like. It gives me fewer articles about what I don't like. So it helps me filter and select information. And we're going to need to be training our young people how to do that. Another huge skill is self-presentation, particularly for those among us who feel led to be programmers. But anytime you've got someone who is very much in their virtual world, they need to learn how to present themselves to the greater world, both online and offline, because you never get a second chance to make a good first impression. And then they need to learn how to do effective social networking. The key there is the word effective, not just social networking. We all know they do tons of that, but it needs to be effective. How do they use a LinkedIn profile to present themselves professionally? Is their Twitter handle going to be for them personally, or is it going to be for their professional life? If it's for them personally, do they want to make it public, or do they want to limit the number of people who can interact with them? If it's professionally, they had better make sure that they don't say anything stupid, because once it's there for good. And so we need to be teaching them those things. Okay, mastering the art of changing context. Any good examples or horrible examples of people who have adapted or failed to adapt? Okay, we'll move on. Late in the afternoon. All right, number 3, the third thing that we need to be doing here to be ready for the next decades is evaluate new developments with wisdom. I would say wisdom and discernment. The Bible says that if we feel like we lack wisdom, we can ask God and He will give it to us. And I know that personally, I feel that I need to go to God asking for wisdom in this realm almost every day of my life. First of all, it's my job. This is what I do for a living. And I need to be judicious and I need to be careful about what I'm looking at. Just because I'm online doesn't mean that I get to allow everything into my mind or into my brain. The other part of that is that not all things are good. Not all things are profitable. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet right now that is not profitable, but is a whole lot of fun, especially younger people. And so there does need to learn to be some self-management there. Because once you've allowed something in your brain, it goes back to changing that brain chemistry, sometimes for good. So we need to model that for our students and the people that we mentor, and we need to show them how to do it for themselves. The most interesting part of this, we're preparing students for a future that we cannot clearly describe. Now I think some of us, I know that my parents would have thought they could have clearly described the future. They probably wouldn't have been able to, but they would have felt comfortable. I would say that probably most parents, older adults, through even the 1980s would have felt really comfortable that they could have described pretty accurately the future that their children would be experiencing. We realize now that that's not the case at all. Difference with us now is we know that whatever the future is for those that are 15, 20, 25 right now, we can't describe it at all. So when we can't describe it, we can't prepare for it concretely. But what we can do is develop the tools that will allow us to manage and deal with anything that we might encounter or anything that they might encounter in that future. So here are some of the things that might possibly be coming up. And I'm going to run through some of the conversations, some of the things that we're reading about what is happening on the web. Not all of this is going to happen, but some of it probably will. So you can have it in your brain. All right, so have you heard about the four-screen world? No, okay, so there's your phone. People have a phone, they've got a tablet, they've got their desktop, they've got their television. Four-screen world. You hear it all the time. Marketing, you probably know this. The concept of the iPad and the couch, right? People sit on their sofa, they're watching their TV, they're also doing stuff on their iPad, and you're marketing to that, right? Because you're smart, exactly. And the thing is, we each have only one set of eyes. And it doesn't matter how fast we dart it back between screens, our attention can only be on one thing at a time. And so, as much as people are talking about the screens, the only screen that matters is the one that is right in front of them at the moment that they're interacting. So this honestly is going to make your jobs really hard over the next few years until they start to get this figured out. Because how can you possibly anticipate whether someone's going to be looking at your material on a screen this size, or on a screen this size, or on a screen this size? How do you prepare for that? But whatever they're looking at, they're only going to have attention for one thing at a time. So you're going to need to figure out, if you want to influence them, how to keep that attention. Second thing I believe that we are going to be seeing before very long is everybody codes. It is going to become the next, Spanish, or even more than that. There are probably 5 or 6 excellent apps out there that teach young children how to code. There are a number of support groups for girls to learn how to code, women, because they don't generally do it. I really believe that in, I was going to say 5 years, maybe a little longer than that, it's going to be unthinkable that you could look at a page and not understand the code. Everybody is going to be expected to understand the code. And maybe you're not going to be the person who's solving all of the most complex problems, but the expectation is going to be that you will, when you look at a page of code, you're going to understand what's happening on that page. Another thing I think we'll be seeing is that gamification is going to begin to refer to testing rather than games. The reason for that is what I spoke of earlier, in that the immediate feedback about performance is there. This generation has come to expect it because they play games all the time. They don't have a lot of patience for not getting honest feedback quickly. So I believe what we're going to see are educational initiatives that bring that immediate feedback of gamification into the educational world. You can do that even without that type of software, those types of games, simply by looking for ways to provide that immediate feedback to your students and the people that you are influencing. I believe our phone is going to become like the remote control of our lives, is one of the phrases. Our external brain, going to remind us of everything that we need to do. We're seeing a little bit of that with Siri, is one. There are apps now that are starting to come out that will understand your habits and remind you of things. You can hook these apps up with every single other feature on your phone, your calendar, your address book, your email, and it gathers all of the data from all of those sources on your phone or on your tablet and then tells you what you need to do next. Now, if you're trying to catch a flight, it's actually pretty cool. I have Southwest app. It's not quite as advanced as some of these others, but it reminds you. It's like, okay, you know what? You are at the airport now. You have got 30 minutes to get to gate B17 to board your airplane. And it makes a loud noise and it reminds you, and it's right in front of you. And if you were browsing too long looking for a magazine in the bookstore, you know that you need to hightail it down to gate B17 because your plane is about ready to board. So that's just one example of how our devices are going to become our external brain. At some point, there are people who believe that augmented reality is actually going to replace our devices. So that would be something like Google Glasses, other types of augmented reality. I won't need a phone anymore. We'll just wear something, wearable devices that will do these things for us, that will maybe take our pulse. Realize that pulse rate's getting a little bit high. We haven't exercised in a week, and remind us that it's time to get to the gym if we value our health. One of the most significant things that I believe, I mean, it's already happening, I believe is only going to grow exponentially, is data. And there's going to be apps and devices and sites gathering data constantly as you allow them to, for you. And because makes life so much easier to do that, because we want to have all of these things connected, we don't want to have the bother of having to call the dishwasher repairman actually by ourselves. You know, our phone does it for us. We are going to be willing to provide all of this data in exchange for that convenience. And so some of the real money over the next 5 to 10 years or so is going to be learning how to manage and exploit that data. And you better believe that companies with deep pockets, this is very valuable to them. They are going to make sure that they learn how to get the insights that they need to get from that data. It's important to us because we need to decide how much data we're willing to give away for convenience.
That's already happening.
Mm-hmm.
There's a add-on, I guess it is, called Ghostery. You can put it on your browser, and what it'll do, is it shows you a list of organizations or programs that are collecting data as you enter that website. It pops down all the different, like Google Analytics would be on almost all of them, and there would be sometimes really, really long list if it's kind of a spammy site.
Yep.
So it's just, it's interesting.
You're right. It's happening, and it's only going to get bigger. So I'm going to recommend that you decide right now how much of your personal information you're willing to exchange for a life of ease. Machine-to-machine communication. That is what many people are seeing that's next on the horizon, where your refrigerator will talk to your telephone, will talk to your heater, and they will get it figured out between them. How much food you need to have, how warm your house needs to be, and what time you need to watch the news. One thing that's been talked about a lot, probably talked to death, but still likely to be happening, the death of the browser. So Internet Explorer, Safari. We're not there yet, but there are a number of technologies that do not use a browser, apps being the one that you're all most familiar with, and the convenience of having something instantly available to you without having to pull up an internet browser, the convenience of having push notifications, being reminded of things, of being able to immediately ask for things, is going to cause developers and companies to think about how they can make that the experience across everything. I believe we're going to see apps become temporary and disposable. There are already a number of products out there that allow people to make their own apps. They still need some development time, some programmer time to get it set up and custom, but I believe we're going to get to the point where opening up an app, creating an app is going to become as simple as getting in your car and driving to work in the morning. And you will be able to use it for whatever your need is. Great news if you're an educator. Lots you can do with it. But then how is that going to change your level of influence? Are certain apps still going to have the same level of influence that they have? The ones that are used all the time, are they going to go away? Is it going to become to the point where an app is almost a personalized thing for the individual person? If so, it's great for education, and you will love it. But that then goes back to everybody needs to know code, too. So, ubiquitous connectivity. Right now, Google is providing fiber internet to test cities around the United States. I know one of them is Austin. The goal of that is to provide free or highly discounted internet service. Blanket an area with free or highly discounted internet service. What Google gets in return for that is the data from all of the browsing that's happening. Because again, are you willing to trade your data for free, high-speed, reliable connectivity? Google bets you are. The other thing I think that we're going to see changing is people's mental models are going to change. We call it opening up an internet web page because when the internet was invented, that was our mental model of how we got information. We got information off of pages. An internet web page is not really a page, is it? It's merely an abstraction of a concept that we knew. So I think that we're going to begin to see people's mental models change about how they describe information. Then finally, we're moving into the Internet of Things. And this is fascinating. This is where everything is connected. The merging of the physical, digital realms. Talked about this several times throughout the course of this afternoon. What we're going to see mostly with that is, again, the increase in the amount and the value of data. And lots of disruptive, novel applications. John Chambers, who's the CEO of Cisco, he calls it the Internet of Everything. What he is saying is he is estimating that the Internet of Things is going to be worth more than $14 trillion in profits to businesses and to companies. It's a lot of money. And that is actually a trend that I believe we're going to be seeing, and he does too. He says 2017, very, very soon. within the next, possibly even the next year or so. Okay, a couple more things. We're actually going to get into now the era of zettabytes, no longer megabytes or gigabytes, but zettabytes. Yeah. In 2017, they are saying that more traffic is going to traverse global networks than in all prior years of the internet combined. There are going to be 2.5 devices or connections for every person on Earth. 5 devices and connections for every internet user. That's more than most people have children. They're going to have more devices than they have children. What's going to happen, though, is that they're going to have more experiences, be able to do more things. It's going to become even more about them and their experience, and better experiences. What that's going to mean is that's going to raise the bar for organizations that do not have deep pockets. The expectation is going to become, what is the experience that a wealthy company like Coca-Cola can provide? And then you start to compare that, and there's no way that ministries and schools are going to be able to rival that type of experience. So what we're going to need to hope is that some of these companies will share some of the wealth, that they will have a heart of charity and will say, we are going to make these great experiences available at a lower cost. That actually could be a job maybe for one of you in this room to begin lobbying for that. Begin making connections and asking people what's going to be happening to the schools when we have this type of connectivity. How are we going to be able to keep up? Okay, this guy named Steven says in 2020 we'll be communicating through pictures and videos again. Text will no longer be worthy of conversation. I don't know if that's true, but it's something to think about. All right, then the last data that I'm going to show you on just a few slides here comes from Mary Meeker's Internet Trends 2013. She is highly respected. Every year about this time she comes out with her thoughts about where the internet is going. She is eerily accurate most of the time. Most of the industry actually does kind of wait on pins and needles for her report to come out, and it came out just actually a few days ago. So I pulled out a couple of her predictions that relate specifically to the work that you do. How many of you were at Michael Hyatt's keynote last night? Okay, do you remember how he showed you a graph of how his blog traffic increased? Isn't it eerily close to the increase that we have seen in information that is shared? It's just been exponential, and it's only going to get more. Sharing information is how this generation communicates. If they can't share it, it doesn't exist. Okay, we're entering the cycle of wearables, drivables, flyables, and scannables. So we'll start looking for that pretty soon. This will be obsolete. And then just here's a history of kind of how the internet's gone. In fact, in that middle section, you can kind of see a computer that looks almost like our first one. But then down at the end, the wearable everywhere computing. She sees that coming as early as next year. Don't be surprised if your students start coming into class with a digital watch that does everything for them. Okay. Sensor-enabled wearable attributes. All the different things that they can do. Hands-free, always on, aware of what's going on, connected. For those of you that are educators, how many of you are familiar with the phrase STEM, S-T-E-M? You want to tell everybody what it means?
Science, technology, engineering, math.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Okay.
That's all correct. And the problem is that there are not enough people going into those fields. And I have personal experience with this, and I'll just tell you this story. A couple months ago, we needed to hire both a Python programmer and a front-end developer at the same time. Now, front-end development is the HTML code that makes your website look like what it's supposed to. It's the JavaScript, it's the CSS. Lots of people know how to do that. The hardcore programming, like Python programming, it's a little bit harder. The hiring manager for the front-end developer put up his job opening and got 50 responses in 3 days. One person even created an entire website just to apply for the job. our programming manager put out his poor, pitiful little job opening for the Python programmer. It took him 4 months to find a candidate. He went through probably 70 or 80 resumes. For our programmers, we give a test to find out if they actually can do the work. I think he must have given 30 or 40 tests to people. Dozens and dozens of interviews, finally hired someone. It was agonizing. And so there's going to be a huge demand. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody can be an engineer. That doesn't mean you want to go into your classrooms and start telling everybody that they need to take programming. Some people are just not wired for that. However, there are people that may be perfectly capable of doing it, love it, but they don't ever because no one's ever said, hey, I think you could do this. I think you could be good at it. And I know if you could talk a couple people into learning Python, I would be very grateful, and I will give you my business card after the presentation. Because we are always looking to hire Python programmers.
Was it a hard test?
You have to pass it, but yeah. I mean, it's not like horrible. We don't have people crying at the end of it, but it does show, whether or not you can do the work. This just is a summary of the spending on education. The one thing I wanted to point out with this is that there are a number of people that believe we're in an education bubble right now for higher education, similar to the housing bubble. And you're nodding your head. And all of the characteristics are there. The lack of accountability, easy access to loans, the rapidly rising costs that outweigh. People don't pay for their college education anymore, they borrow for it. And so those were some of the same characteristics, some of the same things we saw right before the housing crash. And so what that means, or what that might possibly mean, is that the combination of online and in-person learning would be increasing. As the cost of education goes up, more and more people are going to be interested in cheaper ways of getting an education. They may forego it altogether. There are so many examples in this world of self-taught people who have done fantastic, who have done very well for themselves. As the cost of college continues to skyrocket, don't be surprised to see more and more people taking this direction. Yes, massively open online courses. Not everyone believes that these are the answer, and the biggest reason detractors have for it is the lack of community. Completion rates drop drastically when people are not involved personally with a group of people who care about their progress and are spurring them on to finish. So anybody, yes, can take these courses, but the course completion part of it is the difficult thing. And then here's the list of learning tools, and this is pretty fascinating because you can see how they were rated in 2009. 3 years later, there have been some huge jumps. For example, in 2009, Dropbox was 71. Now it's up to number 6 in just 3 years. Lots and lots of people are using that as an educational tool. And you can see that several others have made a huge jump. Facebook has made a big jump as well. Prezi, how many of you know Prezi? Prezi is very cool. Every single time I give a talk, I think, oh, this is going to be the time I learn how to do Prezi. But it never is. But it's amazing. I mean, my daughter has done a couple of them, and it's so visual. It's so interactive. It's perfect for the way that this generation thinks. Okay, how will you be ready in the coming years? You're going to do that by identifying and retaining timeless truths. You are going to master the constantly changing context. You are going to evaluate new developments with wisdom and discernment. So, questions for you, each of you, for yourself. What timeless truth, what one timeless truth in this next week will you emphasize, will you hold on to? Which context, current context, have you mastered, and who can you mentor? Do you know a lot about Prezi? Are you really good at it? Who can you mentor? And then, of some of the things that we've talked about, what new development are you going to conquer first? Thank you for having me, and I'll be happy to take questions.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Cloud computing is a brand new thing for us. I'm a librarian, and we've just put everything in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So that, let's say you could circulate books from your home if you needed to.
Mhm.
I could just log in and
Can you send it to my iPad?
I could,
Ooh.
yeah. So, but it looks like that's, some of the things that you were predicting that would kind of do away with cloud computing pretty soon, because it sounded like what was it? I don't remember what's the exact specific thing, but you were saying that, what is your, well, just tell me, what is your prediction for cloud computing? I mean, I think maybe making the apps that were taking over for browsers, because we say that our cloud computing only works if you only need a browser on your device, and that's how your cloud computing is going to work. But if you don't have a browser, then how are you going to access the cloud, I guess?
Okay, that question's above my pay grade.
Okay.
There are some really smart people at my job that know the answer to that. The one thing I will say is that the data has to be stored somewhere. I mean, even if it's not delivered via browser, it has to be stored somewhere. So, I mean, just based on that, I wouldn't see an end to cloud computing anytime soon.
And security is an issue for
Yeah.
people.
Security's huge, yep. Yeah, it is. And what that would relate to is that, you know, I'm assuming that in each of your contexts, you have somebody who is very knowledgeable about your digital presence. Somebody does need to be looking out for your security. You need to have someone who understands network security, that consults with you, and it helps you to understand what you need to do to stay secure. Yeah.
You said that we need more coders on one hand, but then you also said that everybody codes, that in the future everybody will. So is that going to solve the programming crisis?
Yeah, but not soon enough to get me a programmer. It depends on, when I say coding, there's sort of a basic level of coding that everybody's going to understand. It's like your first and second year Spanish that everybody takes, or first and second, third year Spanish. There's still going to be this entire nether world that only the smart and the brave enter, where they're solving problems that have never been solved before. And there's a certain type of mindset, a certain type of person that loves that. They are hardwired for it, and that is how they want to spend their lives. But it's, you know, if you're not wired, it's super hard.
I actually think that the people who are wired for that don't have an easy path to get into programming right now. Maybe, you know, 15 years ago, you had a Commodore 64, or longer than that, Commodore 64. Before you even could plug in and play your game, it would pop up this thing. You could sit there and try programming. Whereas now, there's not an easy place to go try being a programmer.
Right. Thanks to Apple.
With ubiquitous devices and having even just little snippets of code, people will kind of be drawn into that more. I'm hoping. But you're right, it's not soon enough for you.
It's not soon enough for me. Yeah, I think the
Like you were saying before.
Yeah.
There's the apps that, to teach the basics of HTML and CSS.
Yeah, a couple years ago when I first got into this, content management systems just were awful. And you had, I mean, if you wanted your web pages to look nice, you had to know how to edit the HTML. And so I taught myself how to edit the HTML and the CSS so that I can make the web pages look good. Well, they're smart now, so you don't have to do that. There's absolutely no time now that I would never need to go in and do something like that. But 5 years ago I had to. So.
That brings me to a similar question. We recently were able to hire a librarian who's just more savvy in Web 2.0 kinds of things than Unix system administration, because we're going to the cloud. We don't need to have programmers and coders as much as we need somebody who could do student-centered services. So where does the dwindling need for, isn't there a dwindling need for programmers then? Or
No.
on the local level? Because more and more libraries are not having their own system.
Yeah, I can see that, like where it would make sense for an organization sometimes of 30 people in the past to have actually had a programmer. I can see that changing for sure. There's not going to be an overall lower need for programmers because everything that we're talking about is going to, the Internet of Things, oh my goodness, I mean, how many hundreds of thousands of programmers is that going to require? Now, you're not going to need them in your office, but you will use the fruits of their labors.
So you're gonna fire the programmer and she's gonna hire him.
Yeah.
Only if he learns Python.
Yeah.
We didn't get to hire one in the first place. I was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just depends on your industry.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a shift, but yeah. I know at our company, if we had the budget, we could keep 10 coders, 10 more coders busy all day long, no problem.
Marketing people can always do that to programmers. Yep. It was good enough yesterday, but it's not good enough today. Fix it. Yeah, good. Great questions. Anything else? Okay. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I know it was late in the day. I appreciate it very much. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.